Hello, I'm Mansi from Mansi Makes, and I'm so glad that you're here today. I will be watercoloring this beautiful floral illustration today with Derwent Inktense water-soluble pencils, and I will also be showing you how you can make these images brighter and pop more after the watercoloring is done with Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils. So be sure to listen to my tips and tricks, things to do and things to not do, and I hope you will enjoy this journey. And if you want to watercolor with me, go for it. So I'm going to be using a variety of color pencils today. I'm using Derwent Inktense, and I used about 14 of these pencils, and I will walk you through which ones, the choices I'm making, why I'm making those choices, and how I'm using those color pencils to do my watercoloring. So the first color I chose was a hot red, and that is going to be the base of my petals. That's the first layer. And as you can see, what I'm doing here is, this is the first way of painting with your colored pencils. The water-soluble ones is you just use your colored pencil tip as a palette. So you're picking the paint, the pigment, directly off of the colored pencil tip with your brush. So I'm dipping the brush in water, dabbing off any excess water so I don't have drips. But there's still a significant amount of water in the brush. And then I'm just picking some pigment from the tip of the pencil and introducing that into the flower petal, making sure that the pigment introduction happens towards the inside of the flower petal, where it's the center of the flower petal instead of the outside. The outside is where I'm spreading the color to, and a good way of doing that is if you clean your brush off and just kind of introduce water from the tip of the petal towards the center, it keeps your tip relatively free of color. So there will be a much lighter shade of color towards the tip. Now, the second way you see me of doing this is by actually drawing with your water-soluble colored pencil into the petal. So I'm tracing the lines of the petal, and I'm just going to use my brush, which was dipped in water, to spread the color outward from the middle. Again, keeping sure that my brush doesn't have residual pigment as I'm approaching the tip of the flower petal. So I'm making sure to clean my brush on my rag, on my cloth rag, as I approach the tip. And if I get too much color toward the tip, I make sure that I wipe my brush on the rag. So I take a thirsty brush in, and then I just kind of drag the color back toward the center. And in between, I sometimes will dip my brush in water, clean it with the rag, and then just kind of move the color off of the tip of the petal toward the center. And another way of accenting these lines is by doing your base color first with the technique I showed earlier in the first petal, which is picking the pigment off of the tip of the colored pencil. And so you have a base layer and then going in and drawing in. So you can do both. The effect is pretty much the same, as you can see, whether you draw in first and then color, or you do a base layer and then go draw in. I don't see a marked difference between the two. So it's basically comes down to a matter of personal preference. It might be just easier to draw with the colored pencil first and, figure that bit out, and then just go in with your watercolors. Now, I do tend to avoid doing adjoining petals when the petal next to the one I'm about to paint is still damp. But since I was doing this demo, I just wanted to show, and the reason I'm showing this is also so you can see how much of a bleed might happen if the adjoining petal is too wet. Now, this one was not, because I did the first petal to the right, then I did the second petal to the left, and then I just went in and added some lines with the colored pencil directly in the first petal, but I didn't use that much water. So this first petal right now was not as damp as the second petal would have been. So the third petal I'm doing, I could do it next to the first petal. But you'll see me skipping around quite a bit, and that's the reason for it, is that if there's too much water in one petal and you start doing the petal next to it, it's going to bleed in. And this is true of all different kinds of watercolor media you use, be it colored pencils or markers or paint palettes or tubes. Whatever medium you use for watercoloring, that will hold true. The bleeding is going to happen if the petal next to it is going to be wet. So I realized when I did my third petal that the second petal seemed like it didn't have that much color. The intensity of the color was not that quite high as I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be a deeper, more vibrant red. So I just went in and used my color pencil tip as a palette again, picked some pigment off of it, and then just added some with my brush to the middle of that third petal. Now going in, I decided that these lines, I wanted it to get a no line coloring effect. What that means is that when an image is stamped, if you are using a stamp, you stamp the image on with some kind of an ink that doesn't show the lines of the stamp as clearly. So it could be like tan ink, or it could be a very light gray or a very light pink. I like to use Gina K's Warm Glow. I also like to use Ink on 3's Fade Out ink for my no line coloring. But since this illustration was purchased as is, Emily Midget is the designer. She's the person, the artist who illustrated this flower. And she had printed this out for me on Neenah cardstock, watercolor cardstock. It's 80 pounds. And she shipped it to me like this. So I received this illustration in this kind of a grayscale, dark gray kind of format. And I wanted to give it a no-line colored look, which is why I decided after I did my second petal that I would just trace out the lines inside and not have the gray show through. So the ultimate effect when it's all done is going to be a no-line watercolor effect. I just like the feel of how the no-line effect looks, but if you don't want to do that, then just use the technique that I showed in the first petal where you just pick the pigment off of the colored pencil tip instead of tracing the lines. When I trace the lines, I am applying a lot of pressure so that those lines are intense, because that's where I'm picking my color off of. I want there to be enough pigment for me to distribute that color throughout the petal. I will go in and do second and third layers later, but for my first layer, I want there to be complete coverage, which is why I want those lines to be intense. And they are kind of going to serve as my guide when I start adding the shadows. So don't do a very light line, don't do very light pressure when you're tracing the inside lines of a floral stamp or image that you're coloring. You want that to be intense, you want that to be powerful. So again, pretty much the same technique where I just draw the color out from the pigment of the lines, and if I feel like the inside, the center part of the petal is lacking in depth, I just go in and pick the pigment off of my pencil and just kind of add it in towards the center, making sure I blend it out. So you're not, when you're introducing more color after the fact, then you want to make sure you're blending it out so there aren't like very distinct, there's not a distinct boundary between your dark color and your light color. I hope that makes sense. So essentially just spreading the color out from the lines, excuse me. I didn't mean to cough, but my throat is getting a bit raspy. So when you draw the lines in your petal and you're dragging that color out from the lines throughout the course of the petal, and you find that there are some areas that need to be darker, just go in with the color pencil instead of drawing with the color pencil though. Just go in with the tip of your brush, lift the pigment off of the colored pencil tip and just put that in. So it's a very simple way of darkening the area. And you can already see how, because there are lighter areas towards the end of the petals and darker areas towards the center of the petal, there's already this beautiful flow and character and shape that your petals are getting. This is a beautiful illustration to begin with, so coloring this was not that difficult. But you can introduce more movement in your paintings by controlling where your deeper, darker areas are and where your lighter areas are. So then I decided that I wanted to go in with some more depth to my coloring. So I'm using a chili red and thistle. Now thistle looks like a purple. It has cooler undertones, but it really is kind of a nice magenta-ish, pinkish, deep shade of warm and cold colors combined. So it's a really nice deep color that lends itself very well to something like a hot red. It kind of cools it off, but it also provides an additional depth to your hot red. So those are the two colors, and here I am not tracing anymore. As you might notice, I'm just lifting the pigment off of the colored pencil tip. And that is to control the intensity. When I actually go in and put my pencil to paper, the intensity of the pigment is pretty high. It's not something that can be diluted easily. As you can see, the lines that I traced out in the middle of the petal, they're still quite vibrant. Like, they attract your attention. Your eye goes to them because of how intense they are. Everything else around those lines is blended, but the lines themselves are pretty distinct. So what I wanted to do was make sure the lines looked a bit more like they were part of the flower and not something that was done over and after. So that's what I'm trying to do here. By introducing darker shades of that chili red and the thistle, I am being able to blend out some of those lines. I'm going to keep some of them distinct, but because they're darker colors, they will kind of blend into the darker pigmentation from that hot red tracing of the lines. I'm not trying to completely blend those lines out. I do still want that red to show through. I don't want the gray to show through. So you'll see me back and forth, kind of almost adding a shadow to those lines as I'm blending those colors in. So it looks more natural and not as forced, if that makes any sense. Again, it's up to you how much of blending you want to do with those darker colors. I would put in a word of caution and say not to go too dark at once. Do it slowly. Introduce your darker colors slowly and see, take a step back and see how it's looking, because it's much more difficult to introduce lighter areas into your watercolor painting than to introduce darker areas. You can always go darker. You can't always lift color off and make things lighter that have already become too dark. So just keep that in mind. So go into those areas like the under parts of a petal, like I'm doing right now. So the top petal is casting a shadow on the bottom petal, and that's the part that I am making darker. So just try to visualize, how the petals are laying on top of each other. What parts would get shadow areas? What parts would be deeper in color? And use your judgment in how much depth you want to introduce at this point. You can always go in later when you take a step back and add more depth to certain areas of your painting. And what I mean by that is that right now everything is white, so your context is different. You are seeing all of these colors against a white backdrop. The leaves are white right now too, right? So the way your the flower is going to show after you add green into the image, and after you decide what kind of background you want to have, the way the colors pop is going to look very different. So if you go too dark, then you might not have the option open to you to have a different kind of background. And again, this is a personal choice that you make at this point, is do you want to have a background or do you not want to have a background too? So I kind of don't plan on these things. I basically do my first layer of painting, and then once my first layer is done, I do the whole thing in a first layer. There are many people who when they start watercoloring or doing acrylic paints or whatever medium they're using, they will watercolor one petal at a time and finish it off. That's not what I do. I kind of do the whole image at once, my first layer at once for the entire image, including the leaves and the center part of the flowers, and then I decide what I'm doing next. So again, it's a difference in approach, and based on how you decide to approach your watercoloring, you might end up with a different result. So I am just going in now and adding a little bit more of that dark chili red, the pure chili red, in some petals that are toward the back. And those, to me, feel like they should be darker because they're being, they have that front petal in the front, front petal in the front. That's what's casting a shadow on that petal in the back. So once I was comfortable with how much depth I had already added to my petals, I went in with my greens. And I used the apple green and the spring green to begin with, and I just didn't really follow the lines. I didn't trace out the lines either. I just wanted the leaves to be more, what's the word for it, subdued, and the flower to be kind of the centerpiece. So I didn't want too much attention going to the leaves. They are still a part of this image and they lend themselves beautifully to it. But my main focal point was going to be the flowers. So this is not to say that the leaves got, the step treatment, or, they didn't get as much love. They did. I just didn't want to trace out the lines in those leaves and make that be bold, which is what I did in the flower. It was to accent and add for more boldness in the petals. And then I just went in with some sun yellow and added some brightness to the middle. Now, I didn't realize till I think halfway through this painting that this was a magnolia. And they're kind of, their middles are not that bright yellow. So you'll see me go in later when I'm doing my second layers and adding some brown to it. But now at this point, it's just a matter of figuring out what parts of the painting I want to draw my eye to. And the way you achieve that is by adding darker colors. Now, when I say darker colors, I don't mean that you stay within the color family that you started adding in your first layer. So for example, we started out with reds. So the natural instinct is to go to the deepest possible red and maybe do a red maroon, but that's not what's going to make it pop. It's just going to make it a little bit darker and add some more shadows, and it will make it look beautiful. But what's going to add more of a 3D effect is when you step outside of that color family and you go and reach for a purple, or you reach for a dark brown, or an almost brown black. So the colors you would be reaching out for would be more like a bark, or some kind of a deep purple, a deep indigo, which is one of my favorite ones to go for when I'm adding my shadows at this stage. Or you could also do like a play on charcoal gray and purple and mix those two together. So it's your choice at this point whether you want your flower, if you're using these particular colors with the reds, to become more of a softer, warmer feel, or you want it to become, more of a cooler color. And it's not that when I add the blues and the purples, it's going to change the color of the flower. It's just going to enhance the shadow areas. That's kind of what I'm going for. So my colors of choice in this particular stage were deep indigo, and I went for a rose and a thistle. So I kind of went back and forth between my thistle, my rose, and my deep indigo, and just picked off the colors again with the tip of my brush. Same technique as before. I don't want these colors to overpower the reds, or it kind of looks like pink right now. I don't want them to overpower that. I just want them to lend a sense of familiarity and blend in easily, which is why I am not over diluting them, but also not picking up that much pigment from the tip of the colored pencil. So I have my brush. It's not wet, it's more damp. It's kind of like moist brush. And I'm just kind of going between the deep indigo, and I'm not doing like deep indigo, pick off the deep indigo and then put that on paper, pick off the thistle, put that on paper. I'm not doing that. I'm actually blending on the tips of the colored pencil. So as I'm picking up the color, I'm doing a bit of deep indigo, a bit of thistle, a bit of rose, and then my brush tip has all three colors. So when I use my moist brush tip, all three colors transfer onto the paper, and then I'm able to blend them seamlessly. So that's another tip to have in mind. And you can, if you're not comfortable with the unknown of how much of which pigment you're picking up, because there is that element of unknown in this, because I don't know how much of blue I actually lifted off of the tip and how much of purple I got on. If you're not comfortable with that idea, my recommendation would be to take the pencils and take some kind of a silicone mat and just use your paintbrush, lift off the pigment from the pencil and put it on that watercoloring mat or palette, whatever you want to use. And that way you will actually see how much pigment you're picking off of the palette or that silicone mat instead of picking it up directly from the pencil. Does that make sense? You just use the brush, take the pigment off of the colored pencil tip, put it on your palette, clean your brush on the rag, pick off the other pigment, other color, put it on your palette, and so forth. So that way you know what colors you're picking up and which amount of color you want on the brush. I don't do that for a reason. My reason is that I feel like when you have an unknown blend, there's the variation that you introduce is much more natural. It doesn't feel precise, it doesn't feel measured, it doesn't feel controlled. And to me, there's a certain amount of elegance and beauty in doing it that way. And also, it allows you as an artist to not control everything, right? It's giving yourself the permission to not chase perfection. And you'll see that as an underlying theme in all my creations. I think perfection is absolutely 100% overrated. Nature itself is perfect in its imperfections, and that's what we're trying to mimic here. So why are we trying to perfect it, right? So I don't do the palette method, but if that's what gives you a sense of control as you're starting out and you're nervous, then just, take the pigment off of your colored pencil tip and put it on a palette and then pick it up and, do it like a regular palette painting kind of thing. So again, here, as you can see, even now when it's incomplete in this state, how the under petals have lifted up the petals in the front just by introducing those darker shades of blue and purple in the backdrop, so to speak. So you're not touching the front petals that much or at all actually right now. You're just enhancing the shadow areas in the back petals. Now what happens if you get too much color? Like over here, I just put too much of that purple and it just felt too dark. You shouldn't worry and you shouldn't freak out and you shouldn't panic. All you need to do then is dip your brush in water and clean it with a rag, dip it again in water, and just lift off some of that color, the dark colors that you accidentally put on your flower. It's watercolor, so you have that opportunity to go in, and every time you introduce water into the mix, you have the opportunity to lift up the color that you placed that you didn't want. And that's also a technique sometimes that people will use to lighten up some areas or introduce, like in colored pencil paintings and colored pencil drawings, what people do is use an eraser, right? So they will put in the dark shades and then they want to create fur or they want to create highlight areas. They just take the eraser and they just use whatever micro tip eraser that they have to create those fine lines. It's kind of the same principle when you're doing lifting off the color from a watercolored area that is too dark. You're basically just taking a clean, thirsty brush and you're using that brush to lift the color off. Now you see me going into the front petals that look pale in comparison to the dark petals, which is why I'm introducing a bit of that combination of indigo and thistle and rose into the front petals. And that is because the middle portion of the petal, each petal needs to kind of be in alignment with the rest of the flower. Otherwise it starts looking too odd. So I'm not touching the highlight areas. I'm not going anywhere near those tips of the petals. I just introduced a hint of that purple and blue in some petals on the inside. And you see how it kind of like marries the outside petals with the inside petals, just doing that little bit. And then just adding some brown into I didn't add brown yet. I added some dark blue into the middle of that stamen area, I think that's called. But then I decided, this is too light, it's too cold, it needs to be warmer, and I brought in my bark. So that's what you see me using here. It's the very, very dark brown, and just kind of, again, using the tip of my brush to go around the outline or trace the lines that were sketched on that illustration. And I did notice at this point as I was doing that there are some lines in my flowers that could be enhanced, that could, feel like they are, that middle of the flower is attached to the petals. So I just started adding a little bit, very, very little tiny bit of that dark brown, that bark, into some areas. And again, it is to marry the different components of the petals of the flowers, you know, so that it feels harmonious. It feels like this is one flower. It's not like some petals are getting treated a bit different than the others. You just introduce little blobs of color here and there, so that as your eye travels through the painting, you notice, you know, you're getting that sense of warmth and coldness, or, you know, just that same sense prevails throughout. There's no sense of some parts popping out while others are not. There's just harmony in the painting. Now, when I'd done all of this, I felt the white was not helping my flower at all, the white background. I wanted a really intense background, and I originally thought I would just do like a purple. But when I thought of purple, I also thought of all the purple I had used in the middle of the flower, and I decided a purple is not a wise choice. I want something that's even deeper. So I went ahead and started out with some of my charcoal gray that I had picked up earlier, and I just am coloring the background like you would with a regular color pencil. This is, you know, backgrounds are tricky when you've spent that much time on painting something. I have messed up many a painting, and when I say messed up, I mean that in the kindest way to myself. There are no mistakes in art, but this does require a certain amount of precision, this kind of painting. If you're going for a very clean effect, if you're going for a more negative watercoloring mixed approach, and, you know, the foreground blending into the background, it doesn't really matter, which is what I ended up doing when I messed up my background. I basically blended my foreground into my background, did some negative watercoloring, and it all turned out fine, and still gave me joy, which is the most important thing I look for when I'm watercoloring. I'm not painting this for someone else, I'm painting it for me. I might give it to someone once it's done, but I am not painting something for someone else. My processes are always about, I do this because it gives me joy. I do this because it brings me satisfaction. It puts me at peace. It's, you know, something I do for me. So if I mess up, I mess up. That's, you know, part of the process, part of the journey. So anyway, just did some light colored pencil coloring around the flower. And again, you'll see that I wasn't very careful about my strokes towards the outside. I was just careful about the outline that I made with my color pencil right next to those petals. The rest of it was just more to introduce color so it doesn't stay white and has some pigment there for my next layer. So this is prepping it for the next layer. This and also gives me a sense of what does it look against a dark background, because at this stage I could have changed my idea of doing, you know, a black or a dark gray. I could have just done a purple over this. Now you see the lighting changed, and that's because I took a break. So that's how much I did in one session, and my neck started hurting, my shoulders were hurting, bending down, looking at this painting. And it's detailed work, so it takes time. So if you feel like, you know, this took about, 30 minutes to do, maybe 45. I did speed up the part where I was coloring the black. So if you feel like 45 minutes is feeling too much and you're feeling stressed out and not enjoying the process, just stop. The more breaks you give yourself when you're doing detailed watercoloring, or if you're beginning, you're a beginner just starting out, the more time you take and the more breaks you give yourself, the happier your paintings will be. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. I have seen that in my own work. When I try to just get through it and just finish a project and sit through things because I have deadlines to meet, don't put yourself in that position. You know, do it to give yourself joy, and your paintings will reflect that. Your work will reflect that. I sometimes look at work that I've done in the past where I was feeling rushed, or I was just not, feeling like I was 100% giving it my all in terms of how I was feeling physically. I was tired. Those paintings, others don't notice it, but I do, and that's what's important to me, that I notice the imperfections. I don't mean to say imperfections, but I notice things that could have been done better, that I know I can do better. And I just didn't have time to do that. So at the end of the day, Giving yourself breaks allows you to recenter, to regroup, and to approach your painting again with fresh eyes and to give it the love it deserves, you know. So, coming back to the leaf after the break, I went in with my deeper green, and I think what I used here was a beach green, and I went back with some apple green or some, I think I mixed in some bark in there. I don't actually remember what I did for the deeper color, but I am guessing what I did was a beach green and a bark. What you can also do to get your deeper greens in there is to take some of your, my apple green is sitting there, so I know I didn't use it. But what you can do is you can use some of the lighter green, mix it in with a darker green, and if you're still getting a very bright green and you want kind of a more deeper hue of green, then just add in some browns. That's what I do. And again, doing the same technique where I am lifting the color off of the tip of the colored pencils and mixing them on the tip of my brush. And as it lands on paper, you get those color variations of the gradient, basically, of that brown, which I can now see I am using bark. So it's bark and beach green, a mixture of that bark and beach green. And you can see the color variation happen as the brush slides down that leaf, right? There's water, there's pigment, and all of that kind of marries together in this very fluid way, very natural way. And it doesn't feel forced, it doesn't feel like it's something that was very precise. It's just a loose flow of color kind of coming together in those leaves, if that makes sense. And if you look at leaves, I painted leaves the wrong way for the longest time. I am not a very good leaf painting person. I am still learning how to paint leaves. When I say I painted them the wrong way for the longest time, I actually didn't realize until I think it was last summer that the veins of the leaves are actually lighter in color. When you see paintings, you normally see the veins are colored in dark. That's not how leaves are. If you go outside and look at leaves, you'll notice that the raised parts are actually, the veins are actually lighter in color. So in an illustration like this, it's kind of hard because especially with the technique that I'm trying to do, the no line coloring, if I leave the parts light that have the lines on them, the gray is going to show. I didn't want the gray to show. So my idea was to make the area above and below those lines, leave those areas lighter and kind of color in the line with that darker shade. So that's what I was attempting to do here. And then I just went in again with my lighter green. I used spring green and diluted quite a bit with water and just blended those lines. Again, going back to that notion of not wanting the lines or the veins of the leaves or the leaves themselves be the most prominent thing in this painting. They're more like a supporting actor, right, to the flower, which is the main focus of this painting. So by blending it in with the lighter green, I was able to take away some of that starkness and introduce some more softness to the leaves. And there are many different ways that you could paint leaves. Again, I am not an expert. I'm still learning. You could use like a wider brush. You could use a dagger brush. You could paint leaves so many different ways. But this is how I decided to paint them, following the lines of the illustration. And then I just added a bit of that green to the middle of that magnolia center because magnolias do have that touch of green in the middle. And then I got in my cadmium orange to accent some of those deeper areas. And this is kind of where I went a bit darker in the middle. And it needn't have been that dark. To me, it just felt like I could have gone with the idea of, the center's glowing and I could have had more yellow in there or more lighter orange in there. But I think I went in a little bit darker in that area. So now once I had a sense of, okay, the leaves are in place now. They look good, the flower looks good. Now to darken the background the way I really wanted it, to make it like super dark. So I just took, I'm referring to my photograph that I took of my color pencils laid out together. I took Indian ink and ink black, both of them. So Indian ink is like a darker gray, and ink black is the really, really dark black. So what you see me doing here is using the ink black and just being very, very careful. This is the part that I took my time with. I didn't rush that part that was closest to the flower, because at this point, if I get black anywhere on those tips of those petals, there's really no coming back from it. It's, you can, try to dab it away right away with a paper napkin, put some more water on there and try to take it away, but it will still have that tinge of gray left behind. I didn't want to risk that. If you do end up getting color that's this dark black on your tip of the petal or anywhere close to the boundary of the petal, my suggestion would be to go with the flow and change the shape of the petal at that point. Don't try to save the petal by lifting the paint off or by dabbing the black off. Just change the shape of the petal. Just make it dark black. Change the outline. And I say this from experience because the only way you can recover from that kind of a mistake is that you use gouache, and gouache paint is opaque. So you would use a gouache white and then try to blend that into the rest of the painting, which can be done. But when I'm not doing mixed media and I'm doing pure watercoloring, I try not to mix gouache into my watercoloring. But yes, there is a way. If you do get your black, sometimes, accidents happen. You might just have a slip of the hand and, the brush goes into that light area and you're trying to sit over there and figure it out. So the two options are you change the shape of the petal by just making it dark black, change the outline, coloring that in and make peace with it, or you immediately dab off the black with a paper towel and add some more water, dab off again with a paper towel. If it still has the tinge of gray or it has a big weird splotch now right at the tip of the petal, then just use white gouache and then blend that in with the rest of the pinks or reds or whatever color your petal is. So that's a way of recovering. Now, I didn't do a good job of the straight line at the top edge. There's that little pokey thing coming out, but it was not interfering with the flower, so I just didn't care to address that. I also might cut this frame out and stick it onto a card panel, a card base, so I can take care of that line when I'm doing my cutting. So, there are ways to fix things in your watercoloring, but you just need to, I guess what I'm saying is you just need to not panic. There are ways you can figure this out. Okay, so the background was done. The flower looks really nice. The leaves are decent enough at this point, but it just felt like it was still missing some warmth. So that's when I took my yellow back in and I introduced some warmth into the center. So again, it's a very, very simple way of reintroducing some vibrancy into your painting just by adding a touch of yellow. It's the sun yellow. It's the same yellow that I had used earlier in the middle of the flower, and I'm just kind of introducing some of that into those front petals to make it look a little bit more warm. And that's the part where the watercoloring ends. This is, I am done with watercoloring. This looks great as it is. You actually can leave it be at this point. You don't have to take out your colored pencils that are not water soluble. You can just let it be. The reason I do that is because it really adds more dimension. I have more control. There's no water, so there's no fluidity to the painting anymore. So I can use my really, really sharp tipped colored pencils to introduce those accents. And you can see how I look at my colors in my painting and try to get the closest, deepest colors to those colors. So I got my darker maroons and my reds and my deeper yellow and my dark greens. So I had like a red violet, a dark red, a burnt carmine, a rose carmine, a Schwartz black. I call it a Schwartz black. It's just black. And a dark indigo, a leaf green, May green, an olive green, and a cadmium yellow. And I just, again, I'm doing the same thing that I did earlier with my shadow areas. I love indigo, both for watercoloring pencils and for the colored pencils that are not water soluble. And all I'm doing is using my very, very sharp tip to enhance those areas where I already have my shadow in place. And I'm just going into those little nooks and crannies. Kathy Rakusin is the one who uses this term, nooks and crannies. And I have learned so much from Kathy. She does the daily marker challenge, the 30-day challenge. She's also been doing the shorter 10-day challenge on Instagram. And just following her coloring tips has been so helpful. I highly recommend following her. She has this blog, and just go look at her watercoloring. It's incredible. And she does these accents with the colored pencils after. I'm using the Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils, which again was a recommendation made by her. I had the Derwent Inktense pencils for the longest time, but I never knew that I could use them in conjunction with the Polychromos and really enhance my watercolor paintings the way I can. So I'm just using kind of my eyesight. You know, it's just, this part is more intuitive than anything else. It's you can layer colors over each other with these colored pencils. So don't be afraid to use blue and then use a pink over it. You can totally do that. And if you don't like it, you can use an eraser. Just erase that, you know. This is the easy part. So don't forget that you can layer colors, that you can blend colors in. Go with a lighter hand instead of a darker. I always suggest that when you're using your colored pencils over your watercolor paintings, to go in really light. And if you're heavy-handed and you're afraid that the color you put down is going to be too dark, hold your pencil from at an angle away from the tip. So hold it more towards the stem of the pencil, the end of the pencil, and that way the amount of pressure you exert on paper when introducing that color is going to be less intense. You're going to have less pressure. If you hold it too close to the tip and you're heavy-handed, you will get much darker color in those areas where you might want lighter color. So that's just another tip. I'm not comfortable holding the colored pencils from distance, closer to the tip. To the end of the pencil, I hold them the way you see me holding them, but I go very, very light-handed, and I am just kind of, it's almost like a feather touch on paper, just little highlights, just areas where I feel like there should be a little more blush of pink, or a little more touch of deep indigo, or a little more touch of that maroon. So kind of just going by what I already have done in the watercoloring, laid the foundation for that painting with my water-soluble pencils and just enhancing those details. Now the nooks and crannies is where those petals are touching each other, meeting each other, and that's where I am mostly focusing my attention in this color pencil enhancement. But also some of those lines within the petals that needed a little bit more love. I didn't want any gray showing through from the printing. I just wanted this to look like a no-line watercoloring painting. And so that's what my focus is at this point, is to make sure that none of those gray lines are showing through, and deepening the areas that need some more love. This again is an arduous process, so I highly recommend putting aside time to do this or taking frequent breaks. This can get very tiring. Also, I jumped around a lot, and really if you're starting out, I would figure out a way to do this. So my recommendation would be to, instead of jumping around, okay, let me explain what I did and then tell you what you shouldn't do. So what I did here was jump around. I was scanning the painting with my eyes, and I was looking for areas. I was just looking for areas that needed more cool shades or warmer shades. And I didn't stick to doing one color in one area. I just kind of picked whatever colors were needed in that area, started blending them out, and coming back to them, going to another petal, just randomly going around as my eyes was spotting things that needed more attention. The way I would suggest doing this, a more organized way of doing this, would be to pick a direction, clockwise or anti-clockwise, and to take all your colors and just do one petal at a time. and go in a clockwise or anti-clockwise direction, whichever direction you choose. That way you know that you've touched every single petal, you've finalized every single petal at this stage, and that you're getting it all done. Because when you take a break, you won't know what you've touched and what you haven't, for the most part, if you don't follow a system. And it's not evident right away when you're just hopping all around. It's not evident right away where you've touched and where you haven't. So don't do what I did. Do what I'm telling you to do. It'll just make life a little bit easier. Another way of doing it is organizing it is pick a color and go do that color in each petal, and then do the second color in each petal, and then do the third color in each petal. I don't like doing it that way because I feel like if I'm doing all colors at once, the blending is much easier between the colors, but some people do just one color and be done with that, and then introduce the second, then introduce a third. So see what fits your personality type, see what fits your patience level, and see what appeals to your organization skills. You want to hop around like I do, that's totally fine too. I mean, it's fine. I find randomness to be glorious. So if you want to do what I did, that's fine too. But just again, I'm just adding some warmth, and I'm just adding some, cold areas. If I make it too cold, then I go in and add some warmth. If I make it too warm, I go in and add some coldness, so to speak, or enhance the shadow areas a bit more. But I felt like this flower had started becoming a little bit more pinkish. I started out with a hot red, and I wanted to restore that feeling of warmth in the flower. I wanted that glow, in the flower. And this was the easiest way of doing it, by taking my yellow, and I believe this is the cadmium yellow polychromos pencil, and just taking that and just kind of flicking some color in. And again, not being heavy-handed at all. You can always just add more layers of color and make it deeper, make it more saturated. Just a very, very light touch. And you'll get a sense of it. The more you do it, the more you practice, you'll get a sense of how much pressure is required. So don't worry too much about getting it just right. This takes time, it takes patience, it takes practice. So again, just get a feel for your colors. And I had often asked, how do you know when to stop when you're using colored pencils? Because you can really go overboard. I mean, you have a beautiful watercolor painting to begin with. How do you know when to stop? So I have reached the conclusion that when you overwork it, you will know. Why? Because these pencils, they will go into those nooks and crannies, and they will fill in all those gaps that were left behind in the watercolor paper as the watercolor pigment was embedding itself into the fabric of the paper. There are those nooks and crannies that are left behind where this pigment is going into now from these colored pencils. There will come a point when there's nothing for that pencil to go into, to fill in, and you won't see that color saturation deepen anymore, and that's when you know, okay, this area is done. So just be aware of that, and if you press your color pencils too hard, you will overdo it. You won't even realize when you reach that point. So that's another reason for why you want to go a bit light-handed when you're using your color pencils. Now, I really like using the olive green. It has a yellowish tinge to it. It warms up the leaves, and it also has a very deep sense to it. In conjunction with that deep indigo, it's just a beautiful color, I feel. I was going to say something else, and now it's popped out of my mind. It'll pop back in. But yeah, so just use your color pencils with a very, very light touch, with a very light hand. And again, the same advice as with the watercolors. Don't rush your dark areas. Just take your time. Don't introduce too much darkness at once. You can always add more depth. You can always add more dark layers if you want to. Putting white over the color pencils to try to make areas lighter is doable, but it just gives a very different effect. So it just, to me, it doesn't feel very natural. But yes, there is a way to lighten up your colors too by using a lighter yellow or an ivory or a white. But essentially just go in with a light hand and get a sense of, how much depth you want to put into it, and just take your time with this particular part of it. What else do I need to share in terms of tips? So again, going back and forth with these color pencils too, just blending in and taking my time, making sure that I am not having some areas be completely dark that are not blended in, which is where the light colors come in handy. So when you introduce like a deep indigo or you do the olive green, make sure you go back in with your lighter greens. So here I'm using the May green, and just when I go back in with my indigo, I make sure, when I'm doing my olive green, make sure that I go back in with my May green to blend it out so that there are no harsh lines in these areas, because there are so many lines in this leaf. And you don't want it to look unnatural. You also don't want it to look completely blue. So blending it in with that green and making sure that you blend it outward, again from the center. The same thing that we did in the watercoloring of the flower petals, blending it outwards from the center. So your middle part is the part that ends up being the darkest. And then making sure you have shadow areas where that leaf is overlapping the other leaf so that it looks natural. It doesn't look like, it's all just one leaf. And then I went in with some yellow on the other side of the blue and also on that side, so on the right and the left of the middle vein. And the reason for that was that I wanted that leaf to kind of look, the way it was illustrated was it kind of looked curled, and it kind of looked like it was puffing up in the middle and drooping down towards the ends, if I'm describing it the right way. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it felt like the middle area was more raised and the edges were kind of a little bit more droopy, so to speak. So that's how I was trying to build that effect, to have those areas be lighter towards the edges and have the middle part be more pronounced because it was folding upwards and outwards. So the leaves kind of looked good at this point, and then I just went in and added some more of that red that I had used in the middle of the flowers into the stamen area. And again, it's just, use your judgment at this point. What colors do you feel need to be integrated more into the whole composition? So introducing some green in there, putting in some red, putting in a little bit of like dark brown, the bark, the dark indigo, the black. All of those combined together in the middle. It's the center of your painting, and so it has all the colors of your painting in it. There's, you can find all of them. So once this was done, I went in with my black colored pencil. And again, you can see how fast I'm going. This is hyperlapse, but I was not being very careful in the areas that weren't around the edges of the flower. And again, I had done a basic wash of color with my watercolor pencils at the bottom. So there was just this matter of filling in the nooks and crannies at this point. And again, don't rush it. Take your time. If you're getting tired, take a break, come back to it. Just remember what colors you had, leave them out in case you need to go back in as you're finishing up your coloring. And I did take out my sharpener at this point. I had done the black around the frame, but not around the petals. So I did take out my sharpener at this point, and I sharpened my pencil to give it a really, really nice tip before going around the petals. So the outlines are with a very, very fine tipped pencil. And then I did the same thing with the inside. This is just finishing up. So wherever you see any gaps, wherever you feel, it needs just a little touch of yellow or just a little touch of blush, you just go in and add that. And I did go in with my black to further define some of those nooks and cranny areas. In the middle, I felt like they just needed that little bit of lifting to give that flower just some more dimension. And again, don't overdo this part. Use your judgment and don't rush it. This is your absolute final bit that you do, where you go in and you choose your colors wisely in terms of your deepest colors, what you're putting where, to give this composition a more holistic, well-rounded look, so it doesn't look odd in any way. And there you have it. It's like an hour long process but it's so worth it. And thank you to those of you who sat the entire hour and listened to me yap about it. I hope you enjoyed it and you got some tips out of it, and that you enjoy watercoloring with your water-soluble pencils and then enhancing those details with colored pencils. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.